Hi, my name is Tanya Aurora. I'm a pediatrician and I'm joining you today to talk about vaccines. I hope that by the end of this talk, we're able to identify diseases that are vaccine preventable. We're able to understand some of the concerns underlying vaccine hesitancy and develop tools to address vaccine concerns. I have no disclosures, and I thought I would start by telling you why I'm so passionate about vaccines. I haven't always been as passionate as I am now. After pediatric training, I went into private practice in an affluent area of Los Angeles. This was about 10 years ago, and the parents of my patients were becoming increasingly concerned about what they perceived as vaccine dangers. And I found myself caught between not wanting to make a parent upset, but also wanting to do everything I could to protect the health of their children. And I would find myself negotiating, saying, okay, if I can give the whooping cough at this visit, maybe it's okay to wait till the next visit to give the pneumococcal vaccine. And then through a series of events, I found myself working here with an international aid organization in South Sudan. During my 6 months here, I lost 164 children, mostly from diseases that are easily preventable through vaccination or through access to clean water. After a particularly difficult day, I decided to write an email home. And if you'll allow me to read some of that email, I think it explains the life-changing difference that access to vaccines can make. So my email starts off, most of the diseases I treat here are vaccine preventable. I never thought I would see tetanus, polio, meningitis, or rabies. These diseases, which had so long ago been eliminated in the US, are part of daily life here. Vaccines in South Sudan are only available to children less than 1 year of age, and because of the poor health infrastructure, most children remain unvaccinated. In my 52-bed unit, I have 9 beds, always full of infants and children with tetanus. They spasm with the slightest sound or touch. 2 afternoons a week, when an airplane bringing much needed medical supplies lands at the field nearby, all 9 children go into simultaneous spasm. I don't know how to balance controlling their pain versus over-sedating them. Tetanus is the most painful, gruesome disease I can imagine, like being repeatedly electrocuted every hour of every day for weeks, and at the end of this torture, only 50% will survive. The other beds are filled with patients with dehydration, pneumonia, a few with meningitis, and some burn injuries. Most of the hospitalizations and most of the subsequent deaths could have been prevented with vaccines. Today actually started off great. I walked over to maternity and the midwife let me deliver a baby. And then I sent home a patient that had been here for a month but had shown good recovery from her burn injury. But then a lovely baby I had sent home last month came back. His first hospitalization was at 7 days of life for neonatal tetanus. He was in the lucky 50% here that survived. Now he's back at 3 months with a second vaccine preventable disease. He has pneumonia. I gave him oxygen, breathing treatments, and antibiotics because that's all I had access to, but it wasn't enough. I wasn't able to keep up with what he needed, and eventually he tired him out. We resuscitated him for almost 20 minutes, but I couldn't get him back. I shouldn't have tried for so long, but also I couldn't let him go. After his death, the grandmother explained to me that they thought this miracle boy, this baby who had survived the curse of tetanus, would be blessed to be the first boy in the family to live a long life. Many of the uncles, husbands, brothers, and cousins had been killed in war or died of disease. The family had placed a lot of hope in this child. He was big and chubby, and you knew he was so loved. The parents here don't usually cry. It seems that when they bring their child to the hospital, they're already grieving, knowing that their child probably won't survive. But this time his mother let out that awful wail, the cry that only a mother who has lost her child cries, as if her body is being physically ripped apart, limb by limb, organ by organ. I'm so sick of saying that there's nothing I can do for your child's breathing problem, brain infection, seizures, dehydration, or spasms from tetanus. After all, there is something that could have been done. These children should have been vaccinated. They never should have become sick. No parent should ever have to expect that 1 out of 4 of their children are statistically destined to die before the age of 5 years. I cannot reconcile this with knowing back home we live in such safety that parents feel comfortable refusing life saving vaccines for their children. I cannot understand how these situations can exist in the same world, in my worlds, at the same time. So I started talking about vaccines because every one of those 164 children meant something. They meant something to their parents, they meant something to their siblings, to their country, and they meant something to me. So much of what we face as healthcare providers is beyond our control. Illnesses that are chronic or illnesses with treatments that sometimes are as bad as the disease itself. But these are diseases that are preventable. A safe, effective, inexpensive cure already exists so that these children never have to get sick. Vaccines currently prevent 2.5 million child deaths per year. However, globally, 1 out of every 5 children does not have access to vaccines, which means that one child every 20 seconds, 200 children in this hour that we're together, will die of an entirely preventable cause. Just getting the vaccines that are already available out to the places that need it could prevent an additional 2 million child deaths per year. So how do I take that experience there and translate it to pediatrics here in the US? Well, let's look at what our vaccine schedule is. This is the current childhood vaccination schedule, and it protects against 14 life-threatening diseases. It protects against diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, polio, rotavirus, Haemophilus influenza B, pneumococcus, measles, mumps, rubella, varicella, influenza, hepatitis A, and hepatitis B. There are also important vaccinations for our older children, specifically their Tdap booster, meningococcus vaccine, and the cancer-preventing HPV vaccine. These are just as important as the childhood vaccines, but constitute a separate lecture by themselves. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on the under 6 years old schedule. So in looking at all of these vaccines, it feels like it's a lot of shots received in the first 6 years of life. So I wanted to talk about how vaccines work, and I wanted to address 3 major points. Children today receive far fewer antigens in vaccines than they did 50 years ago. There's no evidence that a healthy child's immune system will be damaged or overwhelmed by receiving several vaccines at one time. And vaccines contain only a tiny fraction of the antigens that children encounter in their daily environment. So the first point, that children receive far fewer antigens in vaccines today than they did 50 years ago. If we look at this table, it describes vaccines through the past 100 years. The first vaccine that we know about is the smallpox vaccine, and it inactivated the cowpox bacteria and gave that to people, and that protected them from the smallpox virus. By the 1960s, other vaccines had evolved, including diphtheria, tetanus, whole cell pertussis, and polio. So diphtheria and tetanus were actually less complicated vaccines to make. There's a toxin that diphtheria bacteria and tetanus bacteria produce. So when developing the vaccine, they would grow the bacteria up in a beaker, create the toxin, inactivate the toxin. That one toxin is equivalent to one protein, which is equivalent to one antigen. So if you inactivate that toxin and you give it to a child, their immune system then recognizes that toxin in future encounters with the bacteria and can kill the bacteria. The whole cell pertussis vaccine is a little bit more complicated. So pertussis is not an easy bacteria. It's really complicated, and we think that there are at least 9 pertussis proteins that play an important role in infection. With the initial pertussis vaccine, because they weren't sure of which protein was important, and at that time the science only allowed you to take one whole bacteria or one toxin, inactivate it, and use that as a vaccine. So when they did that with pertussis, they took the whole bacteria, killed and inactivated the bacteria, and then gave that dead bacteria as the vaccine, that was exposure to really complicated bacteria. So there were 3,000 proteins in that bacterial structure. That means you were exposing a person to 3,000 antigens, and the immune system would then mount a response to those 3,000 antigens. More antigens does mean the immune system gets revved up even more, and so you would see more side effects. In fact, about half the children who were receiving the whole cell pertussis vaccine would develop a fever, and occasionally there would be seizures associated with that fever. In very rare cases, children also developed something called hypotonic hyporesponsive syndrome. It was like a coma that was totally reversible, but it lasted for hours. And as you can imagine, that's really concerning and very scary to, after you get your vaccine, to then be, even though it's entirely reversible, but to be in this hyporeactive state. So over time, a safer pertussis vaccine was developed, and by the late 1990s, we had a whole acellular pertussis vaccine. We know that this acellular pertussis vaccine is not as effective. It is safer. We've traded safety for efficacy, and that's why it's so important to stay on top of getting the pertussis vaccine. It seems that this acellular vaccine provides immunity for only about 3 to 6 years, so it's really important that all the babies get vaccinated on time and all the adults and older children get vaccinated so that they don't become sick and that they don't spread illness. By the 2010 vaccine schedule, influenza, hepatitis A, and rotavirus had been added, and that schedule includes 177 proteins, which is 177 antigens. So the child who gets the full childhood vaccination schedule has 177 different antibodies that protects them against diseases. But I talked about, is this too many? So is 177 antigens, it certainly is. It's protecting them against 14 different life-threatening diseases, which is much less than the 200 antigens that was in the smallpox vaccine, which was only preventing them from one disease. But is 177 still too many? So if we look at it from an immunologic perspective, we know that adults have anywhere from 1 million to 100 million circulating antibodies. If you take the lower estimate, and let's say if an adult has between 1 and 100 million, let's say an 18-year-old has 1 million antibodies produced in their body. So if you divide that up into days, then they would have had to make 152 antibodies per day to make it to 100 million by the time we are 18 years old. If we recall, the whole childhood immunization schedule only had 177 antigens in it. So what we're saying is that to get to a full antibody adult immune system, we are exposed to 152 different antigens a day on average, and the childhood vaccine schedule only in total has 177 antigens. And if you do the math, the childhood vaccine schedule composes only 0.004% of all antigen exposure that children have under the age of 6. So that brings us to the timing of vaccines. We already addressed that the immune system can handle this antigen exposure. It does on a daily basis anyways, but there are important reasons why vaccines are given at certain times. So the vaccine schedule provides protection at the earliest time possible in accordance with when antibody responses are waning. So maternal antibodies transferred to the mom through the placenta start to wean off at about 2 months of age. That's exactly when infants get their first series of vaccines. Their immune systems are immature at this stage, so they build incomplete immunity. So they get the same vaccines at 4 months and the same vaccines at 6 months to ensure that they are protected during this period where their immunity from mom is waning and while their immune system is developing. And it develops in such a way that these vaccines provide long-lasting immunity. it's important to understand that protecting the child at the earliest time possible not only protects the child, but also protects other children around that child in the waiting room and in society. If a child is not able to get sick with an illness, they're also not able to spread that illness to anybody else. It's really important to understand that there are no benefit to delaying vaccines. If you delay it out from 2 months to 3 months, or 4 months to 5 months, there is no benefit to waiting. But we do know absolutely that there is harm in leaving a child exposed to illness. So no benefit in delaying vaccines, and there are known recognized harms in delaying vaccines. Also, I wanted us to think just for a quick minute about how we would decide which vaccines to delay. So let's say that I'm the mom of a 2-month-old child, and I come into your office and I say, I realize vaccines are important and I want to protect my 2-month-old child, but I only want to give them one vaccine. So what vaccine do you recommend? When I ask this question to pediatricians, I get back answers. Well, I would give the polio vaccine because my dad had polio and I saw what polio did to our family, and that was really hard. Someone might say I would give the pertussis vaccine because I know that pertussis is one of the underlying causes of sudden infant death syndrome, and the baby is really at risk for that. Others might say I would give Haemophilus influenza or pneumococcus because meningitis is really terrible. All of those answers are correct, but they're correct because all of the vaccines are important at that stage. So if we are picking and choosing, we're doing that based on anecdote and not based on science. We're doing it based on what we have seen in our families or in our friends or what we're afraid of at the moment. And what we're saying is that we know better than the CDC or the American Academy of Pediatrics or hundreds and thousands of researchers. Um, and what most of us don't realize is that when a vaccine is added to the vaccine schedule at a particular age group, the FDA requires something called concomitant use studies. So, pharmaceutical companies introducing a vaccine into the schedule must ensure that the new vaccine given at that recommended time does not interfere with the immunity or safety of the existing vaccines that are given at that same time. And it also must, in the reverse, show that the existing vaccines that are also given at that same age do not interfere with the safety or efficacy of that newly added vaccine. So that is a schedule that is validated by science and by research in a way that our own individual schedules cannot be. So the answer to that mom of the 2-month-old is that all the childhood vaccines are important, and it's important that they are given in accordance with the schedule at the earliest time possible to prevent disease. When you ask parents of children who did not vaccinate their children and then their child developed a disease, this is a picture of a child in Minnesota. She's holding a picture of herself, and she contracted Haemophilus influenza B during an outbreak that was linked to low immunization rates. And you asked her mom, why did she not vaccinate her child? And she said, honestly, I really never understood how severe the risk was. And so I wanted to take some time and talk about the risks of some of these diseases. So we'll start with pertussis. Pertussis, also known as whooping cough, is one of the leading causes of vaccine-preventable deaths worldwide. There's estimated 16 million cases per year and nearly 200,000 deaths due to whooping cough per year. Whooping cough is highly contagious. It has a secondary attack rate of 80 to 90%, and it requires a really high level of immunization to achieve herd immunity. In fact, 95% of the population needs to be vaccinated to achieve herd immunity. This high immunization rate is true for measles as well. There are less contagious illnesses such as mumps and rubella, which only require about 80% of the population to be vaccinated to achieve herd immunity, which is why you hear of outbreaks of pertussis and measles first when vaccine rates drop off. You also hear people say in response to the chickenpox vaccine, what's the big deal? I had chickenpox as a kid, and so if my kid gets chickenpox, it's not really such a big deal. And chickenpox itself, for most of us, was not a big deal. We might have had an itchy rash. We stayed home from school for a week. Maybe our parents stayed home from work to take care of us. Chickenpox does itself cause serious complications, including pneumonia and encephalitis, but the chickenpox of today is not our mom and dad's chickenpox. It exists in a world where there is antibiotic resistant superinfections such as staph and strep, meaning that the complications of chickenpox can be life threatening, so you can get sepsis and toxic shock. It's also important to realize that because of fantastic, incredible medical advancement, childhood illnesses that were previously deadly are now chronic illnesses, and the children may require continued treatment but are allowed to return to society and survive and try to live as normal of a life as possible, which means that they might return to school or return to daily life where they're interacting with other children. And in these kids who might be post chemotherapy or on other types of immunosuppression, chickenpox is a really big deal and can be deadly. Measles has been in the news a lot lately. Measles causes fever, conjunctivitis, cough, coryza, and rash. It can also cause pneumonia and encephalitis. In fact, for every 1,000 cases of measles, 1 to 3 children will die from respiratory or neurologic complications. In addition, measles can come back many years later and cause something called subacute sclerosing panencephalitis. This is an encephalitis for which there is no treatment. It's progressive and it's incurable and eventually leads to coma and death. There was a measles resurgence in the US in 1989. It was directly related to fears that the MMR vaccine could cause autism. The decreased rate in vaccination resulted in over 50,000 cases of measles, 11,000 complications, and 123 deaths just due to decreased vaccination rates. Um, there was also a more recent outbreak of measles in May 2005. A 17-year-old unvaccinated girl traveled on a mission trip to an orphanage in Romania. She didn't realize that Romania was in the middle of a measles epidemic, and on her flight back, she started to have fever, cough, runny nose, and conjunctivitis. She felt okay, and so the next day went to a picnic in her local town, and there she exposed 500 people to measles. Measles is so contagious that nearly everyone who was not vaccinated at that picnic, whether they had come into direct contact with her or touched something that she had touched 2 hours later, or come into contact with a person who had come into contact with her, nearly everyone who was not vaccinated became sick with measles. Importantly, for those who were vaccinated, only 0.6% became infected with measles. So the vaccine is highly effective and highly protective. Another outbreak occurred in January 2008. A 7-year-old unvaccinated boy was on vacation with his family in Switzerland. He flew back to his home in San Diego, California, and 9 days after return, he developed cough and a runny nose. By the time he showed up at his doctor's office, he had already passed it to other children at his school, and in the doctor's waiting room, he was sitting next to another unvaccinated child who was waiting to see the doctor, and the next day got on a plane for a family vacation in Hawaii, causing the disease to spread to Hawaii. When all was said and done, it had spread across 14 states, infected 140 children, nearly all of whom were unvaccinated, and resulted in 20 hospitalizations. More recently, in late 2014 and early 2015, a measles outbreak started in California, quickly spread across the US into Mexico and Canada, with the rapid spread linked to falling rates of childhood vaccines. In total, there were 147 cases of measles. So you would have thought we would have learned our lesson from the January 2008 outbreak, but the same thing happened in December 2014. So, how did we get here to this point where providers feel like sometimes we're in a fight against parents to vaccinate their children? Clearly, providers and parents want the same thing. They want to ensure the health of their child. But why is it that vaccines is such a trigger for both sides? It's important to understand that vaccine hesitancy is as old as vaccines themselves. So, this is a pamphlet about smallpox. Smallpox, by the time it was done, had killed approximately 500 million people worldwide. It is probably the most devastating disease the world has ever experienced, at least in our known history. Smallpox was introduced to North America by European settlers, and it reduced the population from 70 million to 600,000. So, just the European settlers introducing smallpox to North America took the population down from 70 million people to half a million people. In 1796, Edward Jenner created the smallpox vaccine after understanding that milkmaids who were exposed to cowpox did not seem to develop smallpox. Because of the effectiveness of the vaccine and the deadliness of the disease, the British government started to require that all children be vaccinated by 6 months of age, under penalty that the parents would be subject to fines or imprisonment if their child was not vaccinated. And from the time that the vaccine was introduced, smallpox disease started to wane off, and the threat of disease became less and less. And as the threat of disease became less, you started to see anti vaccination campaigns develop. And they claimed that the smallpox vaccine was a government conspiracy, and that the vaccine contained unnatural products such as the poison of adders, the blood, entrails, and excretion of bats, toads, and suckling whelps. And in this image, you see Edward Jenner is in the center in the long brown coat, and he is depicted injecting people with the cowpox vaccine, and you see people turning into cows or having body parts that turn into cow parts. And it was a real concern amongst people that this cowpox vaccine could cause children to develop with cow parts. um, Mothers were told that it was their duty to protect children from the vaccine inspectors, hide their children from doctors who were seeking power and financial gain, which is not that different than the rhetoric used by the anti vaccination campaigns nowadays. In fact, the modern American anti vaccine movement began on April 19th, 1982. There was a 1 hour documentary film entitled DPT, Vaccine Roulette. So, DPT refers to the whole cell pertussis vaccine plus diphtheria and tetanus. And this 1 hour documentary told story after story of children who developed seizures and brain damage after receiving the pertussis vaccine. Over the next decade, researchers proved that the whole cell pertussis vaccine did not cause any permanent brain damage. But in that intervening 10 years, fears continued to grow amongst parents. Parents allowed their children to go unvaccinated. Children died from pertussis vaccine, and the disease continued to spread. As I noted a minute ago, almost every parent wants what's best for their child, and certainly every provider also wants what's best for that child. Um, and and it's not, this breakdown that we're seeing in communication is not because we have different goals for the child, but a large part of it is because parents are inundated with information about what's best for their child. In fact, there's a children's book available called Melanie's Marvelous Measles, and the description of the book says that Melanie's Marvelous Measles takes children on a journey to learn about the ineffectiveness of vaccinations, to educate children on the benefits of having measles. Often today, we're being bombarded with messages from vested interest to fear all diseases in order for someone to sell some potion or vaccine, when in fact history shows us that in industrialized countries, these diseases are quite benign and, according to natural health sources, beneficial to the body. So you and I know that these diseases are not actually benign at all. But you can imagine that a parent who's not a scientist is reading this, and it's just as scary as what was being said about the smallpox vaccine. Parental concerns have also been fueled by scientific misinformation. In 1998, the British doctor Andrew Wakefield published a possible relationship between bowel disease, autism, and the MMR vaccine. He presented evidence that 12 children had developed intestinal inflammation. He called this autistic enterocolitis after having received the MMR vaccine. His theory was that inflammation caused gut proteins to be released into the circulation. These proteins eventually migrated to the brain and caused permanent damage. Wakefield stated that in most cases, symptoms developed within days of vaccination. However, on later review of the medical records, this was true only for one child. 5 of the children had recognized developmental problems before ever receiving the vaccine, and when it was reviewed later, the hospital pathology reports actually showed no signs of intestinal inflammation or damage. There have been multiple subsequent studies showing no link between the MMR vaccine and autism. And in 2004, there was an investigative report by the Sunday Times in London where it was found that Andrew Wakefield had actually received money from lawyers who were suing vaccine makers. And he was specifically tasked to find an association between MMR and autism. And it's now known that Andrew Wakefield committed scientific fraud by falsifying data for financial profit. His medical license has been revoked, and the article he wrote has been removed from scientific journals, but the damage that he's done is irreversible. Later on, we've seen the Green Our Vaccines campaign launch. So that is the concern that there are too many vaccines too soon and that there's too much stuff in the vaccine. The concern was that there was thimerosal or mercury in the vaccines. They've also expressed concern that there's aluminum, formaldehyde, EDTA. All of these chemicals are used to inactivate the bacterial proteins or act as adjuvants to make the vaccine stronger or to prevent contamination or bacterial overgrowth. These chemicals were now accused of being dangerous, not based on any scientific data, but just because somebody thought they seem unnatural. In response to concerns about thimerosal, in 1999, the U.S. Public Health Service recommended removing thimerosal as a preservative from vaccines. Again, this decision was not based on scientific evidence that thimerosal could be harmful, but just based on concerns that it hadn't yet been scientifically conclusive that it was not harmful. By 2001, thimerosal was removed from all childhood vaccines, and in today's childhood vaccine schedule in the U.S., there are no recommended childhood vaccines that contain thimerosal as a preservative. So each of our childhood vaccines are single-dose vials, so we don't need thimerosal as a preservative to stabilize it. You only need that in the multi-dose vials like the adult flu vaccine that we receive. So there is no thimerosal in any childhood vaccine received in the U.S. unless for some reason every once in a while there's a shortage of flu vaccine and the adult flu vaccine has to be used for children, then yes, that does have thimerosal. But in general, no childhood vaccine has thimerosal. It has been shown since that there is no danger of thimerosal. There have been multiple studies to show that vaccines do not cause mercury to develop in the body or accumulate in the body, and there is no link between mercury-containing vaccines and development of autism. Studies have shown that children who have received vaccines containing thimerosal and children who have not received vaccines have similar rates of autism. So then a concern developed about aluminum. There's a physician in the California area named Dr. Bob, and he suggests this schedule. Again, this schedule is not based on science. It's not based on concomitant use studies. There's no research behind it. His theory is that perhaps aluminum is harmful, and so he gives one aluminum-containing vaccine at each visit. So instead of children receiving vaccines at 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, and then a year of age, they're receiving vaccines according to his schedule at each month of life. and you're having a delay in when you're providing them. So the pneumococcal and the Hib, which would usually be given with the DTaP and the Rota at 2 months, is now being delayed and given at 3 months, leaving that child exposed to pneumococcus and Hib during that month that they're waiting to receive the vaccine, and that their maternal immunity is waning down. So this is all based on the premise that aluminum is harmful. Well, when we look at aluminum, we find that aluminum is the third most abundant element on the Earth's surface, and it's the most abundant metal. In fact, your aluminum exposure by the time you're 6 months of age in vaccines is only 4 milligrams. In breast milk, it's 10 milligrams. If you're doing infant formula, it's 30 milligrams, and soy formula, even higher at 120 milligrams. So, aluminum has also been shown to not be harmful. And all of these concerns are being fueled by things that parents are reading online. And it's really important that we do whatever we can to ensure that their children are protected and that we correct the information that parents have. So, things that we can do is that we need to remember the impact that vaccine preventable diseases have on children. The stories that I told of experiences that I had in South Sudan. I hope I never have to experience those things in the United States. It's really important that we keep our vaccination rates high so that these diseases do not have a resurgence. When parents have misinformation, it's important that we correct them with facts. We need to acknowledge that parents are trying as hard as they can to be good parents, and that they may have fears and concerns, and it's our job to address those fears and concerns and correct those concerns. We need to provide information on safety and efficacy of vaccines, which means we need to educate ourselves on the safety and efficacy of vaccines. And when we are talking about vaccines, it's really important that we use confident and firm language based on scientific evidence and not on anecdote when we speak with families. When you talk to parents about what changed their minds, so parents who came into the pediatrician's office thinking that they were not going to get their child vaccinated, and you talk to them about what changed their mind and why did they decide to get their child vaccinated, the largest thing that had an impact on their decision to vaccinate their child was information from their healthcare provider. So the person who can make a difference in getting children vaccinated is absolutely us. And while those conversations are time consuming and they require us to really be well educated about what we're talking about, those conversations can be life-saving to a child who is going to get fully vaccinated. So, in thinking about additional information, the CDC has a ton of information for providers and for parents. So, here you can find vaccine schedules, questions and answers, up to date information on outbreaks. There's really good webinars and seminars available for providers. The American Academy of Pediatrics also has some really great parent resources and handouts. The Vaccine Education Center out of Children's Hospital Philadelphia also has a lot of great teaching resources. Uh, these are two links. So if you have a patient in your practice who is behind on their vaccines, you can Google CDC catch-up immunizations, and you put in the vaccines that they have already received, and it'll create a catch-up schedule for that child. You can also print out childhood immunization schedules from the CDC, and that'll just allow parents to know what vaccines to expect at what visit so that they can prepare themselves before the visit to be set up for those vaccines. And you can also, again, at these websites, find out information on how to talk about vaccines. So thank you so much for letting me share my experiences working internationally and domestically, and I hope that this helps you provide your patients and their parents with more comprehensive information on vaccines. Thank you so much.